My name's Simon Fisher, and I'm a maritime artist, known throughout the world for my paintings of ships mostly. And they're mostly ocean liners and in some cases warships. And in the research of the warships, one of my main interests is of the Japanese Navy and consequently the conduct of the war in the Pacific. So I have quite a lot of knowledge of how the war progressed and what happened right up until the final dropping of the atom bombs on the two cities in August of 1945.
Okay, Simon, that's very good. Could you just give us a very brief overview? I know it's a huge topic, but a very brief overview of maybe the last 6 months leading up to the final bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Give an overview of the decision to drop the two atom bombs on the two Japanese cities, starting with Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th. One has to have some idea of how the war was progressing somewhere around 6 months before the fatal decision was made. In that period, President Roosevelt died and his place was taken by Harry Truman. And it was his decision to drop the two bombs. This can be a bit of a difficult explanation as to why the decision was made. But if one goes into the history of what was happening in the Pacific up until that time, it becomes clear that this was probably the only option. And in a lot of cases, although it killed very, very many people, it also saved a huge amount of casualties if the home islands of Japan were to be invaded. This was known as Operation Olympic. And estimates were vast as to how many casualties would be suffered by both sides, anything from 150,000 American casualties and a million Japanese. And this was only invading one of the home islands. The prospect of invading and securing all four of the Japanese home islands brings the casualty rate up into the millions. And it was one of the reasons why a quick end to the war was sought. On top of that, Soviet Russia had declared war on Japan late in July, and it was feared that a big invasion from the Soviet Union would complicate matters even more. So eventually Truman decided that his only option was to drop the two bombs.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So just very briefly, it would seem that the dropping of those two bombs was to economize on the loss of life in what had been a very nasty war. Is that a fair comment to make?
Yes, very much so. The war, a lot of people don't realize that over 67 Japanese cities had already been incinerated by firebombing from the big B-29 superfortresses operating out of Tinian, which is in the Marianas. And they'd been bombing Japan for 6 months or more. And casualty rates, especially in the Tokyo area, where one night's raid killed over 100,000 people, or more likely incinerated them, because Japanese cities were very, very lightly constructed and easy to catch fire, not like the bombing in Europe, where cities like London and Berlin were mostly stone and concrete construction. So when you look at the bombing on those cities, you still see the ruined buildings. But if you see the pictures of Japanese cities after the bombing, they're virtually flattened. In fact, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki look completely bereft of buildings, apart from a few concrete buildings jutting up out of the wreckage. And that's because everything just went up in smoke and flame. So Japanese cities were very easy to destroy by setting fire to them.
It does seem very strange. It was almost a humane event to end the Japanese resistance in that way. But I think that that is a way that it has to be looked at. Again, do you think that's a fair comment?
Yes, I mean, obviously, we go back to the Manhattan Project where the atom bomb was being developed. There was a lot of fear that maybe Germany, particularly, might get there first. That wasn't the case because their development was way behind the Americans. The Americans threw a huge amount of time and energy and money into the project, knowing that the first person to achieve this uh, lethal weapon could almost rule the world. I had read in one story that had the European war gone on a little bit longer, the atom bomb could very well have been used in Europe before they used it in the Pacific, which is a pretty awful thought. One of the consequences, I think, that a lot of them didn't realize was the radiation emission caused by the explosions of the bombs. As many people died from radiation sickness after than they did in the actual blast. So casualty figures take into account a large number of people who sickened and died after the explosions.
I see. So the actual dropping of the bombs on those two unfortunate cities, were they fairly close together? I know they weren't on the same day, but were they, within a week of each other?
Yeah, 6th for Hiroshima and the 9th for Nagasaki. Mainly because the Americans felt they had to put the pressure on because the Japanese were still prevaricating. The ruling military caste were determined to go on with the war. They'd almost issued an edict to say that so many million Japanese people would give up their lives to repel the invaders. They still clung on to the hope of this kamikaze maxim. In past, many years ago, China was going to invade Japan and a typhoon came along and virtually sank the invasion fleet. And it was called the Divine Wind, which is where the kamikaze comes from. So it was the military really were looking at the entire populace sacrificing themselves to repel the invader. Another reason why the Americans felt they had to use these two terrible bombs. Otherwise, they'd have just gone on incinerating city after city.
So that being the case, how soon after the event of dropping those bombs did the Japanese actually hold their hands up and surrender?
Just after the 9th, a few days afterwards, the emperor gave his famous talk over the radio to the populace, and he realized that they had to end the war. Yeah. America could threaten to just go around and incinerate everything in sight. The original idea, muted by some of the experts who developed the bomb, was to drop the bomb somewhere as a demonstration rather than on a city. And they didn't think that this would give the Japanese enough proof.
Incentive almost to give in.
Yeah, and I think looking back, that probably wouldn't have worked. I mean, the Japanese fleet, which is I'm interested in a lot, the Navy was virtually destroyed by then. Hiroshima is not far off of Kure Naval Base. There was a thought of dropping it there in order to destroy the rest of the Japanese Navy and proving to them that armies on land could be completely destroyed by one single weapon.
I see. So the bomb and everything was dropped. Now, my understanding is, you did touch on it briefly, that the radiation sickness that followed the event of dropping the bombs cost as many lives as the actual initial bomb damage. But was there a great contamination of the land around those areas, as there was, for example, with the Russian Chernobyl? I know it was a different type of nuclear explosion, more so than an atomic explosion. But did
Yeah.
it cause this ongoing contamination?
Yes, the Americans exploded hundreds of weapons after in various tests in the Nevada desert and the Pacific Islands, Bikini Atoll. They assembled a fleet of old warships there and detonated a bomb above and under the water to see the effects. They polluted huge tracts of the sea by exploding it underwater. They exploded larger weapons. What happened at Hiroshima was part of the fireball, which is just the extent of the plasma cloud caused by the explosion, connected with the ground. It was meant to detonate so that it would explode in the air and not gouge into the ground into like a crater. Whenever it disintegrates any material, it automatically infects it with the radiation. This was sucked up into the cloud and came down as large droplets of rain in the area. Very much like the Japanese accident when the fishing boat, one of the tests in the Pacific, the cloud drifted over a fishing boat full of Japanese fishermen, and most of them died of radiation burns and effects. When they dropped the bombs on the two cities, they didn't really realize how bad the radiation was. There's a lot of research into the effects of the radiation caused by the explosion of the two bombs.
And is that contamination, is it an ongoing thing, or did it clear up relatively quickly?
No, it's an ongoing thing. Depending on how close you were to the actual explosion, you would absorb enough gamma rays within a mile or so of the actual ground zero to kill you. And then as you go further out from the ground zero, the radiation effects become less and less. Gamma rays travel hundreds of meters through the air, very, very deadly. So if you have contaminated debris coming down and you touch it or inhale it particularly, then that in a lot of cases is fatal. It did cause lots of genetic defects, malformed births, that sort of thing. So the after effects were the most horrible thing of an atomic attack.
Yes.
I mean, the explosion itself is a fireball, killed 140,000 people. Firebombing of Tokyo killed 100,000 in similar manner by burning them. But there wasn't the after effects of this deadly rain of radiation.
I see. Yeah. So that land now, though, around Hiroshima, Nagasaki, perfectly safe to grow crops and for people to live on. This far down the line, we're 70 years on nearly now.
Yes, a lot of it was decontaminated. Rubble was taken away and buried, very much like they did at Chernobyl. But the radiation effects there can still be measured. It is still in parts of the ground. But I mean, a modern city's grown up around both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People live there quite normally. The gamma radiation does decay, and after a while it becomes down to what would be called safe levels. I'll add a couple of things, Chris.
Yes, go on.
If you might be interested.
Yes, yeah.
One of the team, Robert Oppenheimer, was the main person developing the Manhattan Project for the first bomb. Of course, the bombs were dropped by two different B-29s, obviously. The first one was called Little Boy because it was a uranium weapon. That was when they developed the bomb from uranium. The Fat Man, which was dropped on Nagasaki, was a different implosion device called plutonium. And plutonium was the new material that is brought about by bringing uranium together into an explosion. So most of the bombs nowadays are made of plutonium, which is an artificial particle that's been produced by developing the uranium weapons. And he has that very famous quote. I can't remember the person who wrote it, but it's called, "I am become death, the shatterer of worlds," which I think really sums up what the atom bomb stands for all of us.
That really puts the top out on
Yeah.
that one, doesn't it?
And another very ironic thing about it was that being interested in the Pacific Navy, in the naval side of it, the Pacific War in the naval side, it was delivered by one of the American heavy cruisers, the Indianapolis. The bombs were delivered to Tinian, ready for loading onto the B-29s. And on its way back to America, the Indianapolis was intercepted by a Japanese submarine and sunk with very great loss of life. There's two very good films about the loss of the Indianapolis, but it seems rather ironic that one of the last major American vessels lost in the war was the one that delivered the two atom bombs.